As he stumbled through the village market square, his own children spat upon his face. Bjorn the Brave, who once commanded 3 long ships and owned lands stretching to the horizon, could now not even buy a piece of bread, for no merchant would accept his silver. His wife had set fire to their marriage bed and found solace in the arms of his younger brother. His name had been struck from every runestone, removed from every saga, erased from all chronicles, as if he had never existed. The Vikings had bestowed upon him a fate worse than death. They had granted him non-existence. Just 6 months prior, Bjorn had been one of the most revered warriors in all of Norway. He owned 400 acres of the most fertile land, commanded 67 warriors in battle, and his word carried weight at the village thing. His sword had tasted blood in 12 different raids on England and Ireland. Kings offered him gold to fight by their side. But on a foggy morning in 987, when Saxon warriors ambushed his raiding party off the coast of Northland, Bjorn committed an act that destroyed him more surely than any blade. How does a society built on honor and valor deal with cowardice so profound that even execution seems merciful? The Vikings had an answer, one that had terrorized Europe for 3 centuries. Not exile, which still left you a name and a memory. Neath, the complete eradication of your existence from human society. You became a walking ghost, technically alive, but stripped of everything that made life worth living. The Vikings understood a truth that modern people have forgotten. There are fates worse than death. As the Saxon shield wall broke their formation and surged through the morning fog, filling the air with battle cries that echoed off the cliffs, Bjorn cast aside his sword and fled. Not a tactical retreat, not a regrouping of forces. It was an unrestrained, panicked flight that left his men to die while he, like a frightened child, ran toward the ships. 17 of his warriors fell in that skirmish because their leader had abandoned them. 8 survivors watched their commander vanish into the mist, imprinting every detail into their memory. The village assembly, known as the Thing, gathered beneath an ancient oak where their ancestors had set laws for 200 years. Bjorn stood in the center of the circle formed by all adult community members. His own father refused to look him in the eye. His wife sat with her back turned to him. The children had been left at home, for no child should witness their father in such a pathetic state. He was accused of bringing upon them a dishonor so profound it defiled the very ground he walked on, of breaking his oath to protect his men, of choosing a life without honor over a glorious death, of being not a man but something more contemptible than the wolves that followed their ships. Tales were told of how he stumbled and fell in his desperate flight, crawling on all 4s along the shoreline, while the men who had trusted him bled out on the cliffs behind him. But the most damning testimony came from his own squire, a 16-year-old youth named Eric, who had accompanied Bjorn in 12 previous battles. Eric's voice trembled as he described how his hero had transformed into something unrecognizable. "He made sounds I'd never heard from a man," Eric recounted to the assembly. "Like a drowning pig, and his eyes, there was nothing of Bjorn the Brave in his eyes. They were the eyes of a creature that should never have been born." First, Bjorn was stripped of his name, not just colloquially, but legally and spiritually. The law speaker declared that the man standing before them was no longer Bjorn Eriksson. He was no longer anyone's son, anyone's father, anyone's husband. He became the Nameless, and uttering his former name aloud was forbidden under penalty. His home was burned to the ground, his livestock was slaughtered, and their meat left to rot. His silver and gold were melted down and poured into the sea. His weapons were shattered into such small fragments that they could not be reforged. The Vikings sought to ensure that nothing he had ever owned could continue to exist in their world. No one could speak to him, look him in the eye, or conduct any business with him. If he entered a building, everyone inside had to immediately leave, lest they risk being defiled by his shame. If he approached a group of people, they had to part ways. He became invisible, yet remained perfectly visible. The psychological torture was perfected. The Nameless could watch his former life continue without him, but he could never again be a part of it. He could see his children playing in the street, but they were legally bound to pretend he didn't exist. He could observe his wife remarrying, her new husband moving into the home that would be built where his own had burned, but he could never again speak to her. He had to survive by foraging in the forest like a wild animal, eating berries, roots, and any small game he could catch with his bare hands. His clothes rotted on his body, for no one dared give him new ones. He slept in caves or under trees, as no roof could shelter him without defiling the owner with his shame. For a man stripped of shelter, warm clothing, and community support, surviving until spring became a daily miracle. The Nameless's hair turned white in his first winter. His teeth fell out from malnutrition. His hands and feet suffered irreversible damage from frostbite. He aged 20 years in 12 months. For 11 long months, his memories tormented him like instruments of torture, relentlessly replaying in his mind. He, once a ruler, now sat in utter darkness, like a phantom vanished from the world he once governed. News of the Nithman, wandering Norway, spread far and wide. Ship captains were strictly forbidden from taking him aboard. Villagers were ordered to strictly uphold the sentence of social death if he dared appear in their lands. His name became a byword throughout Scandinavia, transforming into a cautionary tale, a living lesson on the fate of cowards. Only by performing a feat of incredible bravery, one capable of completely overshadowing his former disgrace, could the Nameless hope to restore his name and status. However, the bar was set impossibly high. He would have to save an entire village from imminent destruction, defeat a renowned enemy chieftain in single combat, or perform an act so legendary that songs would be sung about it for generations. Every day, he tirelessly sought an opportunity to atone for his guilt, aware of how slim his chances were. From afar, he observed Viking raiding parties, hoping to prove his valor, but his presence went unnoticed, and the path to battle was closed to him. He watched fires threaten the village and desperately tried to help extinguish them. Yet people were obligated to ignore his efforts, turning his heroism into a meaningless tragedy. His beard, uncared for, had become a wild and tangled mane. His nails, untouched by shears, resembled the claws of a predator. His skin had taken on an earthy hue from constant exposure to the elements. A stoop became his constant companion, his spine bent from sleeping on rocks and tree roots. Children who accidentally caught sight of him before their parents could pull them away suffered nightmares for weeks. One day, the Nameless spotted Danish warriors setting up camp nearby and realized this was his chance for redemption. He could warn the village of the impending danger and save hundreds of lives. He raced through the streets, desperately shouting about the coming attack, but alas, no one could hear him. People saw him running and yelling, yet the law compelled them to treat him as if he didn't exist. Danish warriors set half the buildings ablaze and took 40 people into slavery. The tragedy could have been averted if someone had heeded the Nameless's warnings. He tried to save them, but his punishment rendered his heroism impossible. After the raid, doubts began to creep into the hearts of some villagers. Had the Nithman's sentence gone too far? They had faithfully upheld their duty by ignoring the coward, but that same honor had led to the deaths of their loved ones. The punishment, so pure and absolute, had turned against the very society it was meant to protect. His former comrades, now led by an adult Eric, the same 16-year-old youth who had become a respected warrior, argued that revoking the punishment would betray the memory of those who had died due to Bjorn's cowardice. The community found itself trapped by its own system of justice. The Nameless's mental state rapidly deteriorated after the failed warning attempt. He began talking to himself incessantly, engaging in lively conversations with non-existent people. He sat by the ashes of his former home, arguing with the ghost of his deceased father. He offered his hand and heart to trees, mistaking them for beautiful maidens. He challenged stones to duels, accusing them of doubting his courage. It was said that at night he would approach campfires, disjointedly recounting battles that never happened and people who never existed. His memory began to create false narratives in which he was still Bjorn the Brave, a respected and honored man. The village children devised a cruel game called Nithman, where one child became invisible and the others had to completely ignore them. The child playing the Nithman desperately tried to get attention, crying, singing, even hurting themselves, but the others had to remain indifferent. The game usually ended with the ignored child having a complete emotional breakdown, which would amuse the others. Parents tried to forbid this pastime, but it constantly resurfaced, teaching children a vital lesson about the values of Viking society. Honor was paramount, and its loss was equivalent to death. The nameless became a living lesson, a visual aid that parents pointed to when explaining to their children why courage was more important than survival. He suffered from an incessant cough that echoed through the forest at night. His left leg began to drag when he walked. His hands constantly trembled, making it almost impossible to forage for food or build shelter. But the most alarming change occurred in his eyes. A cloudy film obscured them, robbing him of his sight. Although he could still perceive, his body, like a predator, was devouring itself from within. The human nervous system was not designed for prolonged and complete social isolation. He was dying of loneliness, but dying an agonizingly slow death. Time dragged on with relentless slowness, like thick tar. The Nameless's appearances near the village became increasingly rare, not due to his desire to avoid human eyes, but simply because of his physical inability to cover the distance from his hiding place to inhabited areas. Villagers increasingly stumbled upon traces of his presence, footprints in the snow, dilapidated campsites with extinguished fires, scraps of clothing caught on tree bark, but no one saw the hermit himself anymore. One early spring morning, a decade after Bjorn the Brave had become the Nameless, a group of children playing at the edge of the forest stumbled upon his lifeless body. He lay curled at the base of a massive pine, as if trying to embrace its mighty trunk. His hands tightly gripped the bark, and his face was pressed against the rough surface. He had frozen to death in the night's cold, but a smile was fixed upon his face. Formally, the Neath sentence ceased upon the condemned's death, yet the community found itself in a quandary, unsure how to deal with the body of a man declared socially non-existent in life. A proper burial was impossible, as it would signify an acknowledgement of his human dignity. But leaving the body to rot on the ground was also unacceptable, as it would defile the forest where children played. Ultimately, a compromise was reached. The body was interred, but in an unmarked plot outside the settlement, without any rites or witnesses. The grave was to remain unacknowledged, unvisited, and unrecognized. The Nameless was buried just as he had lived his final years, in obscurity and oblivion. Eric, by then a 26-year-old warrior respected in the community, volunteered to dig the grave alone. As he worked, he was involuntarily visited by memories of the 16-year-old youth who had once idolized Bjorn the Brave, admiring his strength and courage. He remembered the pride with which he carried the man's sword, how confident he felt fighting shoulder to shoulder with such a fearless warrior. But what haunted Eric's memory most was not the fact of Bjorn's flight itself, but the sound he made at the moment of retreat. It was not a warrior's battle cry, not even the scream of a frightened man, but something animalistic and desperate that should not have come from a human throat. The grave was shallow, as the ground had not yet thawed, but Eric ensured it was deep enough to protect the body from wild animals. As he covered the Nameless's remains with earth, he realized this burial was the first acknowledgement the man had received in a decade. Even in death, he was noticed only for a moment, just enough to be consigned to oblivion forever. Eric pondered whether the Nameless had finally found redemption in his last moments. Not through a heroic deed, but through the simple release from suffering that death brought. Perhaps freezing to death while embracing a tree was the closest he had come to comfort in all those years. The next morning, Eric made a decision that would have horrified his younger self. He approached the unmarked grave and, for the first time in 10 years, spoke Bjorn's name aloud. Not loudly, not theatrically, but simply a quiet acknowledgement that this was a real man with a real name, who had once been worthy of respect. It was a small act of rebellion against the system of justice that had shaped his entire conscious life. News of Eric's visit to the grave spread instantly through the village. Some demanded he be punished for violating the 9th sentence, even after the condemned's death. Others argued that the sentence ceased with the Nameless's death, making Eric's act formally legal. The disputes split the community in two and continued for many months. The true monster, it turned out, was not the coward who fled the battlefield, but the community that chose such a cruel and uncompromising punishment that it poisoned their own souls. They had become people capable of coldly observing a man suffering for 10 years and calling it justice. Upon learning of what happened to the Nameless, some settlements in Scandinavia gradually began to abandon the practice of neath. They realized that a system of justice designed to protect honor could actually destroy it if taken to an absurd extreme. Honor implied respectful treatment of enemies, protection of the weak, and showing mercy when appropriate. A community capable of torturing a man to death through isolation had lost touch with the very values it ostensibly protected. Other communities, however, intensified the application of neath punishment, arguing that any softening of the sentence could provoke cowardice. They pointed out that since Bjorn's punishment, no one else had shown faint-heartedness, which, in their view, proved the system's effectiveness. The fear of social death made their warriors brave and their society strong. Subsequently, sagas began to emerge about communities destroyed by their own cruelty. The Nameless became a legendary figure in Scandinavian folklore, but different versions of his story carried utterly contradictory moral lessons. In some tales, he appeared as a cautionary example of the cost of cowardice, a reminder that honor was above life itself. In others, he was a tragic hero, broken by a society incapable of showing mercy. The story transformed, depending on who told it and what lesson they wished to impart to their audience. The harsh laws of the Vikings, aimed at maintaining order and security within the community, often clashed with moral principles. Strict punitive measures, intended to protect honor and courage, sometimes turned into tragedy, forcing doubts about the justice of absolute retribution. History has preserved evidence of entire Viking settlements experiencing spiritual torment, realizing the moral consequences of their severe decisions. Vikings, contrary to popular belief, were not bloodthirsty barbarians. They were people who sought to find a balance between individual justice and the well-being of the community. However, the search for this balance often led to disagreements and internal conflicts. The cult of honor and courage, which lay at the heart of their culture, was vital for survival in harsh conditions. But when these values were defended through ruthless punishment, moral purity transformed into its opposite, into cruelty and inhumanity. The death of Bjorn the Brave, who became the Nameless, marked not only the end of his personal suffering, but also the beginning of a discussion about justice that continues to this day. Viking culture significantly influenced the formation of legal systems in Europe, and the question raised by this tragic story, whether perfect justice is worth the price that must be paid, remains relevant in the modern world. Legend has it that moans and cries can be heard from the forest on winter nights, but most likely it is only the wind howling through the tree branches. Bjorn's name was erased from memory, but his story forever remained in the hearts of his kinsmen. This story serves as a reminder that there are fates worse than death, But the choices we make in determining those fates say more about ourselves than about those we punish. The Vikings, more than anyone, valued honor and courage, but they also realized that honor devoid of mercy transforms into something terrible. The village where Bjorn the Brave became the Nameless eventually emptied. The reason was not war, epidemics, or natural disasters, but the unwillingness of people to live in a place steeped in pain and suffering. The place where perfect justice was meted out became uninhabitable, which is perhaps the most fitting end to this sorrowful tale.